The talk I'm going to give today has to do with uh, something that struck me about the pandemic as it relates to the Baha'i writings, and so far as the description of as I say, there's much about the pandemic that brought to mind a lot of the Baha'i writings regarding what the future of uh, the human race on planet Earth will be. And that's what I'll be talking about. So a lot of what I say will not be particularly clear to those who are not Baha'is, but I can make them clear if you'll write down any questions you have. And we'll talk about them afterwards. So some of the terminology is uh, familiar to Baha'is, but not necessarily to non-Baha'is. But I think the sense of what I want to say will be clear. I'm going to read this simply because if I don't, I'll take up too much time on the talk and not leave enough time for queries. In a summary statement to the Special UN Committee on Palestine in 1947, Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the Baha'i faith, observed the following. The fundamental principle enunciated by Baha'u'llah, the followers of his faith firmly believe, is that religious truth is not absolute but relative, that divine revelation is a continuous and progressive process, that all the great religions of the world are divine in origin and are one in the same, that their teachings are but facets of one truth, that their functions are complementary, and that they differ only in the non-essential aspects of their doctrines, that their missions represent successive stages in the spiritual evolution of human society. Or put simply, all the religions are from God, and they are revealed successively in a purposeful and progressive manner. If you know anything much about the Baha'i writings, you are aware that much of the focus in the writings is on the three phases of the history of the planet, which are called by the following terms: the history leading up to the Day of Days, which is the day of the declaration of the Bab, or the beginning of the Baha'i revelation. The history, secondly, the history of the heroic age, the early stage of the Baha'i faith. The first part of the formative age, which is where we are right now. And finally, the stages of the formative age that will lead us to the lesser peace, which itself will be a pathway that will evolve into the most great peace, which is also called the golden age of Baha'u'llah in the Baha'i writing. But whether or not we enjoy history and the lessons it has to teach us, we are all of us aware of and curious about the present, about where we are in this process of history and what we can do to contribute to the advancement of what the Baha'i teachings say is the glorious outcome of the human story. We are promised it will come in due time. Consequently, if we pay attention, we will notice how the Guardian exhorts us to be students of history, as well as how much of the Baha'i writings focus on the events leading up to the Baha'i dispensation, how much the Guardian talks about the sequential steps of the progress of the formative age, which we are now in, and finally, how exactly the Guardian spells out the structure and the administration of both the World Federation that will characterize the lesser peace. This will be a secular government, but nevertheless a world government, as well as the further changes that will be ushered in with the advent of what the Baha'i writings call the most great peace, which will come in time, which it's also called the golden age of the Baha'i faith, or the golden age of Baha'u'llah. So I want to explain why I think we all would do well to become students of history, and especially of history as it relates to where we are right now. which a lot of the world right now is depressed and uh, uh, taken aback by the pandemic and the economic consequences of that pandemic. So I want to do a sort of what Einstein called a mind experiment, a little brief one with you. So if you would play along with me, I want you to use your imagination. I want you to imagine that you have awakened one morning and you don't know where you are. You don't know anything about your past and how you got to wherever you are. And you have no idea of what is going to happen to you in the future. So you got that, you're in a room and you're awakening there. No sense of past, no sense of where you are, and no sense of what's going to happen to you. This is the condition in this, what I call a nowhere room, is more or less where the vast majority of humankind abide today. Unless we, as Baha'is or non-Baha'is, are attentive to the guidance we have been given by the Guardian, and presently by the Universal House of Justice, we may not be in much better shape. And let me explain what I mean by that. Because this is an important, even if it is an uncomfortable truth. If we know much again about Baha'i history, especially if we have systematically studied the sequence of study books called the Rui Institute books, we understand something about where we are in the course of human history on our planet. And while the bulk of historians view history as a resulting from the motive force of a struggle for power, the Baha'i writings paint quite a different picture and assert that the actual source of the progress, if you, it doesn't seem like progress now, but the ascent of humankind, at least materially and socially, is the spiritual objective devised by God as the inherent goal of creation as a whole. And of our planet in particular, especially as that process is assisted by the periodic but systematic appearances of the manifestations of God, conveying a fresh infusion of spiritual impetus and specific guidance in the form of laws and ordinances, of exhortations, prohibitions, all of which are perfectly exemplified by the manifestation himself. This again is just a restatement of what I said earlier about progressive revelation, about the sequence of religions, which Baha'is believe are the cause of all the progress of humankind. As a way of examining the Baha'i overview, its past, present, and future, there is a wonderfully succinct and very poetic expression by Baha'u'llah that may well allude to our origin as a unified people, followed by the diaspora, what is called sometimes the out of Africa movement of humankind from its origins in Africa, is what we anthropologists for the most part agree on, where we originated. And finally, the reunification of humankind after we have populated the planet and are coming back together, the beginnings of which we are now experiencing, the beginnings of that reunion, if you are. And reunion is a term that's used a lot in both the Baha'i writings and the writings of other religions insofar as this particular time in history is concerned. It's sometimes called the Day of Days, the time of judgment, and so on. And by judgment, we feel is meant judging our ability to understand what has happened and to make it work. So here is the passage that I was talking about, this poetic passage by Baha'u'llah talking about how God created us as one, and then we became dispersed, and then we came back together. I testify that no sooner had the first word proceeded through the potency of thy will and purpose out of his mouth, and the first call gone forth from his lips, then the whole creation was revolutionized, and all that are in the heavens and all that are on the earth were stirred to the depths. Through that word, the realities of all created things were shaken, were divided, separated, scattered, combined, and reunited, disclosing in both the contingent world and the heavenly kingdom entities of a new creation, and revealing in the unseen realms the signs and tokens of thy unity and oneness. Through that call, thou didst announce unto all thy servants the advent of thy most great revelation and the appearance of thy most perfect cause. Our second view of history in the like the individual in the nowhere room is well, what the Baha'i teachings have to tell us about where we came from, both in the distant past and with regard to those events that began with the revelation of the Bab, who announced the advent of Baha'u'llah, and the end where we presently are right now. So here's the Baha'i view of history. This overview, of course, concerns all the writings that speak of the religions of the past and how gradually, one dispensation at a time, humankind was educated and enlightened about both the material world and its wonders and about the spiritual world and its wonders, as well as our own essential reality as human souls, human spiritual beings operating through an associative relationship with our bodies. What is more important in this regard is that we can learn more about the true reality of those religions in the Baha'i text than we can by turning to the scholars and followers of those religions who still fail to understand or at least resist accepting the divine logic of this progressive revelation, as well as the continuity of the plan of God for this planet and those of us who abide on it. A third aspect of Baha'i view of history as regard the individual us in the nowhere room is that all the authoritative texts have to tell us about where we are right now. So another aspect of Baha'i history is its very explicit description of what we are experiencing, including the pandemic, right at this moment. So it gives us all the history leading up to this point, where we are now. So let me describe a bit. For the peoples of the world, even the stalwart believers and followers of other religions are probably tremoring with understandable fear and consternation about what seems to be the ostensible collapse of human civilization, in spite of everything we seem to have accomplished materially. We as Baha'is know through the authoritative writings very specifically where we are, and even more importantly, where we Baha'is are in relation to God's major plan. And the major plan is God's overall plan for planet Earth, namely that the Earth will become one country, one community, unified and operating very propitiously. And the particular part we must play is also described, how we help in assisting humankind to go to the next stage. Or stated more exactly, the Baha'i writings say we are in the fifth epoch, and this is going to sound difficult to those who aren't familiar with the terms, but we'll talk about it later. We're in the fifth epoch of the formative age of the Baha'i era, which is the first era in the Baha'i cycle. And the Baha'i cycle, we are told in the Baha'i writings, will last no less than 500,000 years. So these terms of epoch, age, era, cycle, these are things we can describe later if we need to, but suffice it to say that the writings talk about the entire history of the planet from beginning to end and describe in fairly exacting detail each of the important parts of each of those stages. Fourth, we know what happens next, and this is where we get to the pandemic and what it has to do with what happens next, because we are in a process as Baha'is, and of course, hopefully the rest of humankind, of ushering in what the Baha'i faith calls the lesser peace, not the most great peace, but the lesser peace, which is something that the other world religions don't discuss much, or they do in very poetic and symbolic terms that most of the followers of those religions don't really comprehend completely. Or to put it more simply, we know that there will be a happy ending to whatever chaos occurs now or in the future. So the pandemic that we're presently enduring, as well as other trials and tribulations, some of which will follow on the heels of this, will ultimately bring about the lesser peace, because the leaders of the world will of necessity turn to the logic of creating a world federation, what the Baha'i writings called a global commonwealth, as the only solution to human survival, let alone human prosperity. Fifth, why is the present trial that we're experiencing right now, that is engulfing the nations of the world, the corona pandemic, any different from other divisive and onerous conditions that afflict the prosperity of our planet? And I believe that the answer to this question has to do with at least two aspects of this sudden and unexpected calamity. For example, we all know that the world presently suffers from a vast and ever increasing disparity between the few who control the majority of the world's wealth and the world's power, and those who struggle daily simply to survive, to obtain the bare necessities of life, the shelter, water, food, education, medical assistance. And yet, wretched and widespread as these conditions are, they do not compel the majority of the nations of the world to take action, at least not unified and collective action. Second, the world engulfing crises, such as the pollution of our natural resources of air, water, food, while also global in nature, are not yet of sufficient magnitude to cause those who are in power and who have the wealth and control of the world to focus their attention on maintaining personal wealth and switch to something else, because the status quo is precisely what they desire. Response to the pandemic, however, is something that has come up that can't be ignored by these few. In the course of a couple of months, it has dominated every conversation, has dictated what we can and cannot do on a daily basis, and has, through fear of contagion, united people as no other cause or ideology or even military force could have done, at least not right now, and not so completely or so quickly. In addition, the consequence of ignoring or responding haphazardly to the pandemic, whether by local, national, or international leaders, is not the retribution by some overbearing political power. This force is not being perpetrated by anyone, but by nature. It is being sustained by something we do not yet understand, nor can we control it, except by one single means: a unified and selfless global action. So that's why this is a distinct kind of crisis we're facing. It could be that this is not the calamity mentioned in the writings that will bring about the lesser peace. After all, the Guardian himself repeatedly discusses that the deterioration of contemporary society and actions is only part of a complex process that will usher in that world unity. Indeed, in this sense, the Guardian says the following: the development of infernal engines of war, the burning of cities, the contamination of the atmosphere of the earth, these stand out as the signs and portents that must either herald or accompany the retributive calamity, which is decreed by him who is the judge and redeemer of mankind, must, sooner or later, afflict a society which, for the most part, and for over a century, has turned a deaf ear to the voice of God's messenger for this day. A calamity which must purge the human race of the dross of its age-long corruptions and weld its component parts into a firmly knit world-embracing fellowship. He also states that he himself does not know. He deceased in 1957, and so he was stating this before 1957. He also states that he himself does not know what form this calamity will take. He says, we have no indication of exactly what nature the apocalyptic upheaval will be. It might be another war, but as students of the Baha'i writings, it is clear that the longer the divine physician, that is Baha'u'llah, is withheld from healing the ills of the world, the more severe will be the crises and the more terrible the sufferings of the patient. Finally, the Universal House of Justice itself, urging the Baha'i community to stop focusing on the darkness of this time and instead to study and follow the guidance that they have brought forth, state, although there is every reason to expect that the world will experience in the future a testing as never before, we do not know what form these upheavals will take, exactly when they will come, how severe they will be, and how long they will last. So, while the present pandemic may not be the singular event that ushers in what Baha'u'llah says will ultimately be an unimaginably glorious consequence of these events, we cannot ignore how this worldwide event has caused people who have no reason to be wise in matters of global polity to call for a world government. Former Prime Minister of Britain, Gordon Brown, a few weeks ago, urged the world leaders to create a temporary form of global government to tackle the twin medical and economic crises caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. But he's not alone in calling for a global federation as the necessary and unique solution to world peace and security. Proclaiming that the nations of the world are at a historic turning point, former Soviet Union President Mikhail Gorbachev came to the site of Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech to call for the creation of a new global government. He said a restructured and greatly strengthened United Nations, for example, could shape world events and ensure a lasting peace. And this is a quote from him. Humanity is at a major turning point, he said. We live in a watershed era. One epoch has ended and a second is commencing. No one yet knows how concrete it will be. What then is the conclusion that we as Baha'is, and even those who are not Baha'is, must come as a result of viewing these, our place in history, where we came from, what our purpose is, and where we will go? what do we do and what do we understand? We know what the future will bring. Ultimately, the Baha'i writings assure us we will have first a secular world government, which will ultimately become a spiritual enterprise. And we know the part we must play in helping to usher in that global transformation. As Baha'is, we are told to have faith in science, in reason, and most importantly, in the infallible guidance of the Universal House of Justice. And what does that divine institution say to us in the midst of this pandemic? After exhorting us in no uncertain terms about how we must strive to achieve the goals in this final year of the fourth of 5-year plans that will culminate with the end of what the Baha'i faith calls the first century of the formative age, the Universal House of Justice on the 9th of this month, the 9th of March, of May, sent this letter to the Baha'is of the world and really to the peoples of the world. It is not possible to foresee the extent to which this pandemic will influence the movement towards unity among the nations. But there is no doubt whatsoever that for the endeavors of the Baha'i community, the months ahead will be consequential. Indeed, it could hardly be otherwise. This final year of the final plan in a series spanning the final quarter of the formative age will seal the foundation upon which will rest the next series of global undertakings. It is the concluding act in a captivating drama whose end is yet unwritten. Well, I threw a lot at you, but mostly it was a view of the Baha'i concept of where we are in history, how we got here, what is going to happen, and how we can help bring about the positive results of what will happen, but also affirming that where we are is not comfortable. It is not meant to be comfortable, but we're meant to learn from it. Okay, I will now attempt to answer any questions you might have. Attempt being the operative word. So John, if you would feed to me any questions that you think might benefit the audience as a whole, I'll be happy to respond as best I can.
Absolutely. So the first question is in respect to where you think the trajectory is, given that these next coming months themselves are so consequential, given that the world leaders have effectively spoken to deaf ears as to this creation of a mechanism to stop the problem, yet increasingly isolationist and nationalist agendas to do exactly the opposite. What is, in your opinion, the trajectory that we are going now?
Okay, I understand. First of all, when I say the next few months, what the House of Justice is referring to is that, and this again is in a Baha'i context, which a non-Baha'i would not understand. The Baha'is of the world have a very exact administrative order, and the highest institution of that order is the elected members of the House of Justice. And I was quoting when I was talking about the coming months, that was reading from the letter of the House of Justice. And what it's referring to is the coming months in a plan that they devise. In other words, we're always under a plan of, okay, here's what we need to work on here, because the ultimate vision of where we are going, both as Baha'is and non-Baha'i, the world is going, is world unity. Now, what the questioner is getting at is that we seem to have suddenly gone from the celebration of globalism, which was all the rage about 20 years ago up till about 10 years ago, and then suddenly it started reversing, and so that we are going back to nationalism and isolationism and so on. So what that phrase was referring to is what Baha'is must do to continue their goal of building communities around the world to form what I like to call the skeletal framework for the future. And that is to have a structure which is independent of, at the present, governmental structures, because Baha'is are not involved in party politics, nor do we join political parties, but instead try to build spiritual communities, not as devices or vehicles for proselytizing, but to actually build healthy communities around the world, aware of each other. So the faith is the communications for the around the world is the Baha'is have access to what's happening everywhere in the Baha'i world. And so the questioner then asks, what do it basically is asking, what do I think will change the very negative things that have happened, not just the pandemic, but that has caused the isolationism and blaming, where instead of all the countries getting together to solve this problem, each seems bent on accusing the other of having started it. Each wants to keep its own equipment. I mean, so you have Brazil, which is denying doing much of anything, but it's in terrible shape. You have, well, I don't need to, you see it on the news every day. You know what's happening. And the same thing is true within the United States, for example, where you'll have each state is in a different condition regarding the pandemic. There's no unity among the states, and there's no unity that the federal government is not attempting to bring about unity, but further dividing and so on. So I'm sorry, I'm babbling, but so what will change? What the Baha'i writings, as I read them, hint at there and go into more detail later, is that things will get worse. And of course, there are a lot of economists saying that things are going to get a lot worse as a result of this pandemic. How bad, we don't know. We may come out of it, the economy may recover and we'll be back where we were before it started within a year or two or 10 or whatever. The point is that the Baha'i writings very explicitly state that travails will increase until such point that, like Gorbachev and Brown, the world leaders, their former world leaders who in retrospect now see what should have happened and could have happened, and now what must happen, more and more, there will be no other choice. And the pandemic is interesting in this respect because it knows no master. It's not the product of an ideology. It is apolitical. It doesn't care who it kills. The positive aspect of it is that your community you live in is probably responding one way or another. If we don't, of course, then it will get worse. And in other words, at some point, some force or combination or sequence of events and forces will cause the world leaders to form some secular form of federation of governments, so that you will have world unity. You may not have world prosperity until that body starts dealing with the inequities and other problems. One way I like to put this, and then I know I've talked a lot, so I'll put it to an end here. One way I've always liked to think about this is and it's a very trite analogy, but it works. You don't you don't break the laws of justice any more than you can break a physical law. So if you try to break the law of gravity, you're going to find gravity will win every time. Every time you jump off that building, you're going to die. Well, the same thing is true with social injustice and injustice against our planet, the way we have with plastic in the ocean, poisoning the air, and so on. You can violate these laws, but the law stands. The law says you hurt nature too much and nature will kill you. The same thing is true with you have too much inequity, and ultimately those who have not will take over from those who have. And of course, that's what the whole communist movement, the idealistic part of it, was about 150 years ago. Okay, I've talked too much on that. Anything else?
So there was a question related to the subject you brought up, and this is from Mr. Gilbert from Florida. The question is, what roadmap do you envision in the political unification of the planet? Now, I remember a quote that was mentioned by you, that was cited by you, excuse me, where we talked about the end of corruption being one of the ways that is necessary for this to be accomplished. How do you envision this political unification and also tackling that corruption that we so widely see around us becoming worse and worse?
All I have to do is repeat the two quotes that I had from Shoghi Effendi and the other one from the House of Justice, which says, we don't know what form this will take, how long it will last, and so on. And so who am I to outguess what they themselves admitted they don't know? So exactly what path I don't know, but broadly we do know. And in fact, there is a passage that I could pull up now that talks about where the Guardian talks about the stages through which the lesser peace will go.
So I do have a question that follows up on this that I
Okay.
think you should answer. It's two questions, but I'm going to combine them. The first part was, would secularism be a stepping stone to the unification of mankind? And is the divestiture, the departure from religion, is it a prerequisite to that unification of the planet?
Say the second part of that again.
Is the divestiture and departure from religion, is that a prerequisite to unification of the planet?
Well, that's already occurred, and it's occurring more and more, but I don't know that it can get much worse. I mean, where you have science is seen as anathema by the people of faith, I mean, and so on. So you have this schism between science and religion is now at a point where it's just absurd and laughable if it weren't so horrible. But what was the first part of the question about the secular?
Yeah, the first part was about secularism being a stepping stone to the unification.
Oh, okay, yeah, it is. It is in this sense. The writings. There's one part in the Baha'i writings that is misunderstood, from my opinion, in the World Order of Bahá'u'lláh by Shoghi Effendi, where he gets the schema for the government that will most likely be formed as the secular form of the world government. And so the Baha'i writings assure us that the first stage will not be the result of anything the Baha'i faith does. It will come about out of pure necessity. And so, yes, you could say to a certain extent that secularism in its in its crudest form or negative form, that is society without any sense of religion or faith or belief or spirituality or spiritual virtues as a prerequisite for unity. You will have, in other words, just strategically, it's got to happen. But as I say, you can't segregate spiritual law from physical law. All right, let's put it this way. Spiritual law has the same weight or effect as physical law. So even secular, purist, humanist, secularist will ultimately see the unwisdom of having this great gulf between those who have power and substance and those who don't. They will have no other choice. So in that sense, yes, secularism has both caused the problem and will also, it will be a secular, it'll be a logical result of secular thinking that will cause this first unification or stage of unification to take place. Now, of course, the Baha'i writings say there's a lot we as Baha'is can do to help lessen the travail that will be experienced because of this process. And so that's what we are busy at work with now, is trying to create a framework. And you have, of course, this term framework for action throughout the Baha'i writings of the guidance, that we're trying to create a framework for a fallen humanity, so that when all else fails, say everything fails, you have the Baha'i administration is still there, and the Baha'i concept of community governance, and so on is still there. Again, this is something we could talk about endlessly, but I don't want to go off on too many tangents, so we can get some other questions in. But I don't know if I answered that sufficiently or not.
Well, I think it leads into this other question. It's from two people, and I'm going to be combining them for ease. The question was, and this is from Alex from St. Pete Beach over here in Florida. Now, the chat, people send a chat and I jumped down. One moment.
Okay.
I'm going to read this question. Okay, here we go. And then it was combined with another question asking the same thing. Since the purpose of physical reality is to provide analogies for understanding spiritual concepts.
When it start over again.
Since the purpose of physical reality is to provide analogies for understanding spiritual concepts, what do you think is the metaphorical significance of things like illnesses, viruses, and the pandemic? And the other question as well that was asked was about us as humanity not following the religious principles that we're taught. Do you think that do you associate this pandemic to civilization not following the words of God, or simply the way Mother Nature is combating or reacting to the human virus on the planet Earth?
Oh, that's lovely, and I appreciate the lead with the last part of that, because obviously, is that from Alex too? That last part?
No, as I said, I combined two questions.
Oh, okay, yeah. No, the pandemic is a great metaphor, isn't it? That it's almost like, because this is something I had thought of as well. We are like the virus. Humankind has become the virus that's killing the planet, and so the planet's fighting back. Baha'is in the Baha'i writings stress very much that we believe in science and logic. And in fact, of course, this famous or well-known passage by Abdu'l-Baha, where he says, if religion does not follow the standards of science, then it simply becomes superstition and a leap of faith that has no basis, and ultimately it will fail. And so we believe very much in science and logic. And so logically, obviously, we don't believe that the pandemic or any other ailment is sent by God for the purpose of retribution or something like that. It is the natural consequence. In other words, so why, how can we in any way say the pandemic, by looking at the pandemic, we should see what we have done that's wrong? Well, I think we could sit here and brainstorm, and if we had enough time, we could get in a circle and brainstorm. What have we learned from this in the form of spiritual and social virtues? Well, we said one of those at the very beginning: unity. We become isolated, nationalistic, and this is showing us that, hey, we could have stopped this thing right up front if we had all been unified at the beginning, had a unified health system. The World Health Organization had the full support and so on. China had not, if it did, try to hide the extent to which this thing was unfolding. And if everyone else had accepted, the World Health Organization stepped in, okay, everybody, here's what's happening and here's what you need to do. It could have been stopped immediately. And of course, that's what happened in a couple of countries. It happened for the most part in New Zealand. South Korea did a pretty good job. So if you could take the model from those, you'd say, okay, it shows us what we could do if we had followed the guidance of Baha'u'llah, who 150 years ago wrote to the kings and rulers of the world and said, you need to form a world government. If you do that now, you will have world peace immediately. If you don't, world peace will still come about because it's the natural sequence of this planet that it will naturally become that. It's sort of like, if you will, an acorn's going to become an oak. You can retard its ability to do that by not giving it enough water or whatever, and its growth can be stunted or so on. But the destiny of the planet is that it will become a world civilization. And again, I could go into this in a lot more detail, but you could almost say that, this phrase, the Goldilocks position of planet Earth in relation to the sun, and we're looking for other Goldilocks planets that might also have produced human life. Once you have a planet capable of bringing about human life, then you have its natural destiny is to become unified. It's the logical outcome, and that logical outcome, we believe as Baha'is, is assisted by the spiritual empowerment of that outcome, by the assistance of God sending teachers to help it along. So it's gonna happen. So getting back to the question, what can we learn from this? 1,000 things. I'd say the need for unity is one, the need for the sharing of science. Again, we could rattle off probably 20 or 30 different things we should have learned. How are we responsible for it? We're responsible for it because of, as I say, because we weren't prepared as we should have been. There were, and I don't want to get political, but the previous United States administration, for example, had foreseen this and had done things to prepare for it. That is the possibility or likelihood of a pandemic. Again, I'm babbling, but you get my idea. There's so many ways to. That's a beautiful question, and it's worthy of a class for sure.
Thank you, and Alex, I hope you got more than your fill, and you see there may be a independent session based off of this. So thank you for asking.
And of course, there's a personal aspect, because his question went beyond collective trials, but personal trials and tribulation. And I think each person has to decide, the personal you know, why do bad things happen to good people? Well, this is something I wrote about in the book, in a couple of books, but the purpose of physical reality, and a couple of other books. But that's a biggie. How do you justify God's ways to man? And of course, a lot of humorous philosophers like to say, how do you justify man's ways to God? And that's a better question. Okay.
Since you just said that, there was a question asked, which this will directly segue into. And I know a lot of people have this question because their question is, well, what can I do? In other words, this question, how do we live out our principles of the faith to promote unity, which are in absolute opposition to corrupt nationalist and even globalist government ideas and agendas?
Okay, here's let me go right to the heart of this question, or the heart of the answer to this question. What we have learned, not just as Baha'is, but what humankind is learning right now and will learn more profoundly in the future, is you can't legislate morality. You can't create a healthy, happy society from the top down. It has to go from the bottom up. This is something the Baha'i administrative institution realized very long ago. And so instead of trying to create massive populations of Baha'is, we have been given plans that say, okay, create community where you are, wherever you are. And of course, the first thing that was done with the Baha'i faith was it was very purposefully, by the Guardian, spread all over the planet. And he had a map, which those of you who've been on pilgrimage have probably seen, where he would say, okay, we don't have anybody on this island, we got to send somebody here. In the 10-year World Crusade, that's what the whole emphasis was. We're going to elect a House of Justice. To do that, we need to have national assemblies all over the nations of the world. Until we have that, we don't have the pillars to uphold the foundation, or the pillars that will be the foundation to uphold the ultimate or supreme institution of the House of Justice. So what the House of Justice now has done is say, okay, we can't legislate, impose this. We've got to build it from the ground up. And so that's what Baha'is are presently doing, is they're trying to create spiritual communities where they live. And again, I could spend a couple of hours going over the institute process and how all of this is being executed. But suffice it to say, there are places in the world where the Baha'i institution of the local assembly is the governing body of that community, villages in remote areas and so on.
Okay, the next question is about schools. So what do you recommend in the education of children, of students, of people in secondary school, in undergraduate education, people who are coming into the world today? What do you recommend in educating people to help establish this lesser peace? What would be the elements? And then another question, which I'll combine to maybe make it easier. Can
You're gonna make that easier?
Well, that's a very broad thing. This is more specific.
No kidding. Okay, go ahead.
Can we use common ethics as a backdoor to spiritual revelation based ethics to be more acceptable to the common man without actually mentioning religion?
All right, I want you to repeat that question, but before you do, since I went to the trouble to find it for everybody, the passage I was trying to find, the stage of establishment, is in Messages to the Baha'i World, 1950 through 57, page 155, and it says the following. Yeah, and it's talking about the World Crusade, which was from 53 to 63. And he says, the present crusade on the threshold of which we now stand will, moreover, by virtue of the dynamic forces it will release, and its wide repercussions over the entire surface of the globe contribute effectively to the acceleration of yet another process of tremendous significance, which will carry the steadily evolving faith of Baha'u'llah through its present stages of obscurity, of repression, of emancipation and recognition, stages one or another of which Baha'i national communities in various parts of the world are now find themselves, to the stage of establishment, the stage at which the faith of Baha'u'llah will be recognized by civil authorities as the state religion, similar to that which Christianity entered in the following the death of Emperor Constantine. And that's another place where he says that. Now let me go back to education, because we all need education. And the question was, how do we create an education that will not impose, the sense of it I got, will not impose religion, but will still effectively enable the student to do what was the rest of it?
To assist in the establishment of the lesser peace. To be an active participant, to be a protagonist rather than an antagonist.
Yeah, I presume this is referring to what can we do at the local level.
In educating others, yes.
Yeah,
like especially
because I mean, you know,
school.
yeah, I presume when you'll have an international government, you'll have an international education oversight body that will try to secure a decent education for everybody. And in fact, curriculum, of course, will probably evolve over centuries so that everyone has access to something decent. What you do at the local level depends exactly or precisely on where you are, where you live, what the conditions are. If you are in a place where there are decent school systems and you can work through the school, participate in the school, so on, that's fine. My wife and I homeschooled our children because we, for a number of reasons, but the main one was that they weren't getting a good education in the public system. And it was more like, forgive, I mean, the education system tries the best it can to do what it can, depending on where you live. But it was a negative experience, even socialization, which we also think education is good for. But when you can't talk unless you raise your hand and you have no free time to assemble together and so on, there's not much socialization going on. So we decided to homeschool our children and then have them socialize by avocations outside school, such as sports, arts, and other places where people can get together, where that's the sole reason for their getting together. Hit me again with some aspect of the question I didn't respond to there.
So for those who may run schools in general, just people who are in the education system, what can they introduce to assist in establishing that lesser peace?
Depends on whether they're in a public or private school and have the ability to shape their curriculum. The fact is that, of course, we all know the problems in public education, teaching for tests or teaching to test, that education, forgive me, but it's in the public system is just, it's not the fault of the teachers, it's the fault of what the goal of education is seen to be, which is to send you to the higher level, which will send you to the higher level after that, which will send you to a vocation where you can make money and have the golden dream of American materialism. And so materialism has infested that too. Insofar as what you could, I can't answer it in any specific sense because if you are a teacher in a public school, you have no say-so in what you teach or how you teach, not much. You can show love toward your students. You can have them, if they're doing a writing assignment, try to write on something dealing with virtue. and so on. This is precisely why we have a parallel system right now in the Baha'i faith, where we have classes for children, classes for junior youth, junior youth spiritual animation programs, and so on. My wife is taught in both of those, and they're extremely good in instilling in the students, and they thirst for what we have to teach them about virtue, very indirectly, not imposing the Baha'i faith in any way, in some cases not even mentioning the Baha'i faith. And it just has amazing results because they get this nowhere else, where they work together, they play together, they do things where they have to interact in so many different ways and so on. So, I mean, I can't give a specific answer because it depends completely on how good the school system is where you are. In some places in the United States and elsewhere, the school systems are great, and allow the teacher freedom to be innovative in so far as incorporating concepts of spirituality. So I hope that answers a little bit, but it's an impossible question to answer with any specificity because it's entirely dependent on what your circumstances are in the neighborhood and community where you live.
Thank you for that. And actually, since you mentioned virtues, there is a question on that. How do you see the growth of trustworthiness achieving the goal stated by Baha'u'llah? And this is the quote: "Trustworthiness is the supreme instrument of the protection of the prosperity of humanity." Oh, never mind. He says not necessarily an exact quote. I thought it was. Gosh. Anyway, the point is though that trustworthiness, it seems very relevant to the concept of corruption that we discussed earlier, but more importantly to the idea of virtue education you just mentioned now, relating this to trustworthiness.
It's interesting that I think it's in Rui Book 1. One of the experiments, or it may be Book 2, I forget. One of the exercises is where it says trustworthiness is the foundation of all other virtues. And you say, why would that be? And you do a mind game again, a mental exercise where you ask each person to write down or think about what change would you experience on a daily basis if everybody had this single virtue, just this one. You can forget about all the others, justice, kindness, whatever. I mean, you don't forget about them ultimately, but just for now with your mind game. If everybody simply had that one virtue, trustworthy, how would your day be different? And it's amazing the result. Everything changes because you can trust everything the politicians say. You can trust everything, in business. You don't have to worry about people lying to you. So in that sense is what I think is meant in the writings by trustworthy being the foundation of all other virtues. You can have every other virtue, but if you're not reliable, if you aren't trustworthy, none of the others have much meaning. Certainly not as much. So it doesn't mean it's the only virtue necessary, but it is. First, you got to do that.
Thank you for that. Yes, I totally agree. And that being said, talking about trustworthiness and truthfulness and all that, it leads to the subject of Susan from Seminole. And this question is, Seminole, Florida. What do we do when there are scientists and doctors who are split on the planning of how to proceed in this pandemic? And she says, seems like what you read from Shoghi Effendi seems really to imply that this thing is very holistic. She feels that it's not being addressed really in terms of the world. But again, back to her question, what do we do when we see scientists and doctors among themselves? They are not in unity. They're not unified at all on what to do.
Well, you don't want them to be unified when they're in the stage of testing and examining and learning. And that's where they are. This thing is a novel virus. This thing is unusual. This thing is mysterious. We've never seen anything like it. And so the question, as it was stated, is what do we do? Well, since we have no influence over it, we don't have to do anything except follow the best advice that we trust. So that deal goes back to trustworthiness again. So, I mean, what we do personally to guard our own health is to do take the course that would protect you the greatest, I presume. But what if you mean what should our attitude be when we can't even trust the scientists? Well, what you're talking about is not necessarily they aren't trustworthy. They're not. There are not so many of the scientists at war with one another the way the political attitudes about this are. The scientists just have different theories, and they're in a theoretical stage of examination right now. And of course, trying to find the antidote, the antidote to it, the vaccine, and they're seeming to make some progress and so on. But insofar as what you should do, so I mean, you have Fauci saying on one day, along with Dr. Birx, stay in your house, and then he says, now if you stay in your house too long, the society will collapse, and so on. They're doing the best they can, we must presume, with the knowledge they have at any given stage of this exploratory state of examining this thing. I don't know if that answered the question, but in other words, what do we do? I think the intent of the question is, what should our attitude be if we can't even trust the scientists? And our attitude is the best we can. We trust the most trustworthy person that we can find. And so far as what we do with the pandemic, we follow the best advice that seems, so since I'm elderly and so on, the only place I go is to my physical therapist, and I wear a mask when I do that. And I fortunately live in a home with my wife and my son and his wife and my grandson, and we have a ball. But then not everyone has the luxury of having a place that can accommodate that many people, and where we're all Baha'is and get together and have virtual firesides and so on. So I mean, I'm getting way off base here, but at any rate, hope that helps.
No, thank you. And there was a question also posed, and this is relating to that subject of corruption. Again, this is a question from someone who asked, I have to go back up to see who. How can we teach people to accept a world government, or I'm going to put in a federation of governments even, when so many national governments are corrupt as they are today? How would a world government escape corruption? So how would we get out of that problem?
To a certain extent, as I have said implicitly, the problem will resolve itself. Injustice doesn't work. Ultimately, injustice fails. And so wherever you've had a dictator or someone who is corrupt or a government is corrupt, it ultimately will fall. Now, the question was, what can we do? Or at least the way it was first articulated was, what can we do? As Baha'is, we work within the tools that are given us, which are creating community where we do have a say-so, and we do have control over our lives to the extent that we have what control we do have. You cannot, if there's not much else you can do other than let the system that is corrupting itself fall under the weight of its own corruption. This doesn't mean you should not, or that you should ignore what you can do as a citizen by writing your congressman or whatever to exhort them to vote for a bill or to consider these things about world unity. But you can't impose it. If you impose it, the only way you can impose world unity is with a power sufficient to do that, which means you've just created another dictatorial power. So power won't do it. That's why you take this indirect method that Baha'u'llah says, since you've rejected doing it voluntarily, let's do it involuntarily. Let's go through chaos until you see the wisdom of what I've said in the first place. So the thing about spiritual principle is, as I say, is they're based in logic, and they are the best way to do something. And ultimately, you go to the best way because you've tried all the other ways that didn't work. So there's not much we can do other than create a system that will be there regardless of what happens to planet Earth or to whatever the politicians do. You've got the foundational structure. And remember, that's the first thing. You'd think it would be the very last thing. You'd think you'd want to get congregations of great size and so on. No, the first thing that was done, and this is, if I have time to say it, it's something very, it was a talk I was going to give, and I ended up not being able to give it, about, as a Baha'i book that was put together. It's very useful. It's a, I'm trying to see who did it. It's a basic Baha'i chronology by Wendy Moman and a man named Cameron. And what's how it relates to what I'm talking about is this. As you read through, it goes through the months of each year. It's about 500 pages long. And on one entry, it may say, Mary Jones was the first Baha'i on the island of Toga. Okay, she wasn't, but let's presume she was, because I don't want to go open the book right now. I actually could, but and you think, well, that's in a book. What's the big deal with that? Well, the big deal was this was the first thing the Guardian started doing, and you see how early that started. Was he was directing, okay, you want to serve the faith, we need someone in the Hebrides. Go to the Hebrides and establish a community. And so that's the first thing he did, was to produce a skeletal framework of the before you could complete the administrative order. Remember, and I know most Baha'is know this, but maybe many don't. When Abdu'l-Baha died, there was great clamor to immediately elect the House of Justice. Even the Guardian presumed that the will and testament of Abdu'l-Baha would use him, Shoghi Effendi, to pull together the existing Baha'i communities to elect the House of Justice, because the Baha'i communities there were a lot of them. Of course, they weren't national communities because there was no such thing at that time. There was only the local communities, but there were many of them all around the world. So, not all around the world, but a lot, enough to elect a House of Justice. But Abdu'l-Baha, in his wisdom and infallibility, said, I'm creating a new institution that will elect the House of Justice, an intermediary institution, a national assembly. They will elect the House of Justice. Well, there weren't any national assemblies. So the Guardian realized, before we can do anything, we can't elect a House of Justice until we have these pillars, these national assemblies. And that's what he went about doing. And you can't have national assemblies until, or what good would it do if all the national assemblies are in Europe, or all the national assemblies are in the Western Hemisphere? And so he conscientiously and systematically started directing people. You go here, you go there, and so on. What was the question? I got up on this. What am I answering?
So the question, that's a great question. I have to go back and
Oh yeah, well, at any rate, I think that answered it. whatever it was, I hope I answered it. If not,
I believe you did. That's not a question.
it's possible. I said a
specific
lot
question.
of things.
No, I know you did. It's just a specific question I asked. I like to quote the person who said it, and I'm getting a flurry of text. I can just tell you that.
Okay.
So that
deal with the flurry as best you can, my friend.
Yes. So I do want to pose this question since it's a mixture between what gentleman Barmak Kusha said. I don't know where he's from, and a mixture from Jeremiah. I'm going to combine them two together for you.
Barmak Kusha, you may be interested in knowing, is an epidemiologist who lives in the Tampa area and is writing an article, which you better get to me pretty soon, for this coming issue of the journal, which will be on the pandemic, the Journal for Baha'i Studies.
Interesting.
It is interesting, isn't it?
Yes. So for everybody who's listening, you now have a sneak peek as to one of the works that will be published very, very soon in the Journal for Baha'i Studies. The organization, the Association for Baha'i Studies, is an association that is open for people to join. It is a very, very prolific organization where people like Dr. John Hatcher have made phenomenal contributions, and this is weaving in the writings of the Baha'i faith, but it is scholarly works, and these scholarly works. Yes.
The journal, by the way, is available. You don't have to join. You can download all of the articles from the past issues as well, and it's been around for more than 35 years. You can download them online as PDF files by simply going to the Association for Baha'i Studies website, and you will see, as you go in, you will see the journal, and you will see past issues as one thing. And so when this issue comes out, this will be the spring-summer issue, you'll be able to see and the whole issue is dedicated to the pandemic. And in fact, the talk I just gave you will be part of the introduction to that issue. So that will be, when it's done, it will be online and available to download, or you can buy it if you want the hard copy. Now, I'm sorry, go ahead, John.
No, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. We appreciate it very, very much.
Sure.
And I know the viewers who are listening to this thereafter will, in retrospect, they'll be able to access this by the time they see this as well. Hopefully.
Hopefully.
Yeah, if they see it too soon, maybe not retrospect. Anyway, so here's your question, again, from Dr. Barmak. So here we go. The question is about scientists' differing advice and opinions. Oh, not a doctor, epidemiologist. Okay, sorry. Thank you, Barmak. All right.
He doesn't want to vaunt himself, but he's very vauntable.
Yes, indeed. So he says, regarding the question about scientists' differing advice and opinions, but their stress is consensus as to what is being or what is to be done by the public among the vast majority of public health and medical professionals in terms of prevention and of treatment, correct? And then he says, I think what is different this time is that a lot of this back and forth that is normally healthy in science is happening in real time with some sort of media spin and is affected by the tendentious politicians. What do you think of that, Dr. Hatcher? And he also made a amendment. He says, in real time and in public.
Yeah, the last part of that is very important, and that is normally all this is going on in JAMA or in or the Lancet. I'm talking about medical things. JAMA being the Journal of American Journal of the American Medical Association, and the Lancet is the UK version of the same thing. They're both journals that deal with articles on research, but usually this is all going on in the background, and you'll have theories and then competing theories. And if you remember this very important quote from the Baha'i writings, and it is very subtle but extremely important, and it has to do with consultation and everything else. And it's very simple. It says, from the clash of differing opinions, the spark of truth will emerge. That's not the exact quote, but it's essentially that. And it doesn't say the clash of people, the clash of ideas, the spark of truth. And so you want this discourse going on. And as Barmak has said, the guidance from the medical establishment is clear. They've been quashed and toned down for political reasons, but I have no question in my mind about what should be taking place right now, anywhere. Again, if you want to follow example, just listen to what the Prime Minister of New Zealand says and does, and follow her, because she's become more or less a political saint in the world of politics. She's an amazing woman. What she did with the shooting in Christchurch, the Muslims, how she responded to that, and how she responded to the pandemic, and she is so beloved and so smart and so selfless in a way. But I get off the point. The fact is that, as Barmak says, there's no divergence of opinion so far as what you should do. I mean, you wash your hand, you wear your mask, and so on. The fact that it has become politicized by, and I don't want to get into the particulars of that because we all know them because we can't avoid them. And unfortunately, it's a curse that we have to live under, that we hear this constant chatter, so that when you politicize scientific truth, even as was done by the Roman Catholic Church back in the day when real science was just emerging, and you have people like Galileo being quashed, Copernicus being, and so on. That's the same kind of political thing where you have special interests trying to shape truth. True science wants to discover the truth about reality, and that's all they're interested in. And the way you do that is you have differing opinions and different people discovering different things, and sometimes they seem to contradict, but ultimately, you go back to the analogy of the 6 men or however many men are examining, the blind men are examining an elephant, and one says it's skinny like a rope because he has hold of the tail, and one says it's like a heavy blanket because he's got hold of the ear, et cetera, et cetera. So they're examining the same thing, they just don't know that they're examining different aspects of it. So a lot of times differences in science are simply different perspectives of the nature of what they're examining. But with this pandemic, the differences are very minimal insofar as what test should we use? Well, should we use the blood tests, or we use the et cetera? You know what I'm talking about. But at any rate, as Barmak says, there's no, we know what to do wherever you are, and there's been no differing opinions about distancing, washing hands, wearing masks, etc. The interesting thing about the mask wearing, of course, is people were saying, I want to be free. I don't want to be told to wear a mask because I know I won't get this. Well, you wear a mask to prevent others from getting it. This is a selfless act. This isn't, well, at any rate, I don't want to rattle on, but because we hear this discussed every day. So you have a few brave souls. The problem, of course, is when the brave souls who have any political alliance or allegiance are working for a government agent, they're going to be fired or quashed if they come out with a theory that is against or that hints at a political alliance with the powers that be.
So there is a question, and this is sourcing a little bit back in time, and time is a very good word to describe this question because of the nature of the question. When you mention something that may have gone over a couple people's heads regarding epoch and like the time periods and so on.
Yeah.
So can you please explain as to epochs and ages in the Baha'i writings?
Yes, I can, but I won't. No. Interestingly, my wife and I were talking about this yesterday because she is teaching a study circle on book, is it 8 or 9? Book 9, which gets into that very thing of why the history is important and what these terms mean. So they're simply dealing with different divisions of time. And so we have the most familiar division of time from a Baha'i perspective is a dispensation, the period of time during which a particular manifestation's religion endures. So the Christianity from a Baha'i point of view begins in approximately, well, during the life of Christ. He presumably died around, who knows, 30, 34 AD, or CE as we now call it, Common Era. And it ended with the advent of Islam from a Baha'i point of view. That is effectively a new religion, a new dispensation began. Now, of course, the religion continued to exist and did some good things and did some bad things. So that's a dispensation, is the time of the beginning to the end of a religion. So then the dispensation of Muhammad was from 620, I believe. I think 620, his Hijra from Mecca to Medina. And until the advent of the Bab, the declaration of the Bab, which we celebrated yesterday or day before in the evening, in 1844. And let me hold this book up. This is a book so worthwhile.
A basic Baha'i chronology. Who's the author?
The author is Cameron and Momin, but Glenn Cameron for the most part. It's put out by George Ronald, and it is so good. And you wouldn't think, because it's a chronology, it's a list of dates and what happened on a particular month in a particular year. For the heck of it, one evening I started reading through it, and you wouldn't think you would want to read through a chronology, but it was so revealing, because you see, like on this date, Martha Root died, but then you see on that same date or that same month, somebody else who became a hand of the cause was born or something like that. And you see the confluence, you see the continuity, the story, how everything is linked to everything else. I find it a really valuable instrument, but go ahead.
No, thank you. That is very, very valuable. So I want to first say the person who asked the question, Sapide from St. Petersburg, says thank you for answering that question. The other point is that we are out of time. So everybody, this is Dr. John Hatcher, and he has, over the course of an hour and a half, answered amazing questions. We thank you so much, Dr. Hatcher.
My
And
pleasure.
with that being said, this is May 24th, 2020. Thank you, everybody. Good day.